short book by a British scholar. He's a brilliant guy. But what he does, I think it would be worth us taking a little bit of our time through rather than just rushing it. Now, the book is called The Surprising Genius of Jesus. So again, the book isn't about the prodigal son, but the prodigal son is the seminal work that proves his thesis. And among other things, he basically wants to argue that Jesus is unique in teachers throughout history, that he is uniquely genius. You can tell it through his teachings. And I think you'll see some of that just in discussing the prodigal son. So what we've seen in our study of prodigal son, again, there's others. Actually, if you want to read more of prodigal son, Kenneth Kitchen's books on prodigal son are excellent. We've looked at some of his stuff before, so I don't want to revisit it. And I think 3 books is enough. But John MacArthur, you may remember, offered a cultural exegesis of this parable. So that is, he talked a lot about the honor-shame culture. So what the father does is dishonorable, what the son does is shameful, so on and so forth. Tim Keller offered a theological exegesis of it. So he's going to talk a lot about sin and salvation and God the Father, stuff like that. What Peter Williams does is I've described it as a linguistic exegesis of the parable. That is, he's going to dive into the original language. And what he shows is that the words Jesus chooses are not arbitrary. So, obviously, this is a short story. It's verses 11 to 32, not long at all. It is 388 words in the original Greek. It's a short story. You could read it in just a few minutes, if that. But it's the longest of Jesus' parables. And you've probably heard that brevity is the soul of wit, that the art of good writing is actually brevity. That if it takes you 2 sentences to say something, try to narrow it down to 1 sentence. And Jesus is gifted with that sort of stuff. He can say so much in such little space. And so what he does is he says that Jesus communicates a lot in very little space. So what I want to do is walk through the parable. We've read through it, and we'll read through it again. And then next week, he takes this linguistic approach, and he shows how broad it is. Okay, we'll cross that bridge next week. Actually, the real blessing of Williams we'll look at next week. So you have to come back next week. We'll get a discount ticket, okay? If you come back next week, is the real payoff. Because I think you're going to see just how incredible this parable is. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. But you got to do the dirty work of the text. So the story for Williams is in 2 acts. This is typical. The story of the younger son and the part with the older brother. And both stories conclude the same. So look at verse 24. This is the end of the first section, Act 1. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. Well, that's the end of Act 1. Well, notice how Act 2 ends, verse 32. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. It's the same language. So in terms of understanding how a story is told, that in the story there can be markers to when it's a new chapter. Genesis does this like 4 or 5 times. These are the generations of Adam. These are the generations of Cain. These are generations of Noah, so on and so forth. They mark breaks in the story arc. And what he wants you to see is that this story in 2 parts is an extension of the first 2 parables. So think about it. The parable of the lost sheep is that a sheep leaves home and is returned. The parable of the lost coin is that a coin is lost at home and is found. So what you get in the prodigal son is both parables in this story. You get a son that is lost and by running away from home, but he is returned. But then you get a story about a lost son that stays at home. And we'll get to the conclusion about what we ought to anticipate with that. So with that, let's start in Act 1. we want to actually go back to verse 1 and 2. The first phrase we want to look at is the words hear versus grumble in verses 1 and 2. Now, the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him, and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." Now, this is, of course, draws a distinction, right? The sinners are hearing, the Pharisees are grumbling. This actually goes back to chapter 14. So if you go back to chapter 14, verse 34, so this is right before we come to chapter 15. Remember, when Luke wrote this, there's no chapter or verse divisions. So salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. And then what is the very next verse? For us, it's the new chapter, but for Luke, it's not. You have sinners and tax collectors who hear. They draw near and they hear. You have Pharisees who grumble. That's not an accident. The reference to hearing, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. This is found throughout the New Testament. Here is just one example. I could give you others. Matthew 13:9, Mark 4:9, Luke 8:8, and of course Luke 14:35 we just looked at. That phrase, he who has an ear to hear, let him hear, actually comes from the Jewish Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. We looked at that in some detail a few weeks ago on Sunday nights. And so right away, we have this setup. Jesus saying, I need you to hear this. Right? It's just like the Shema. You need to hear it. And then he tells three stories in the context of those who hear and those who grumble. Now, the word grumble is not an accidental word. Because they are essentially opposites. People who grumble do not hear. And those who hear are not at that time grumbling. Now, they may not like what they hear and grumble, but while they are hearing, they are not grumbling. These are in many ways opposites. When you think of the word grumble, I bet there's a story in the Bible that comes to mind. And that, of course, is the Exodus. So you get this in Exodus 15. The people grumbled against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? Exodus 16, the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses. Just to give you one more example, here's one from Numbers. And all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. You could look at a dozen more. So right away, we have sinners listening. And you have the so-called righteous grumbling. Williams calls this the piety of the impious and the impiety of the pious. This is played out in the prodigal story, that the younger son never grumbles against his father. He never does. The older brother does. And as we've seen, it's kind of obvious. The younger son is representative of the tax collectors and sinners. So when he comes to his senses, he listens to what his father says. And he doesn't grumble. He doesn't argue. He doesn't do any of that. But the older brother, who is representative of the Pharisees, that's all he does. Whenever he speaks, he's whining and complaining. And so right away we're set up with this. We've got language of the Shema, we've got language of the Exodus. And so we would expect the Pharisees to be the ones who are hearing, because they say the Shema every day. But right away we're told everything's the opposites. The bad guys aren't the tax collectors and sinners. They're listening to God. It's the ones who think they don't need to hear God. They stay on the outside in the story. Or consider the word them. This is in chapter 15, verse 12. So we'll go down. So there was a man who had two sons. We're going to come back to that next week. The younger of them, verse 12, said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. He divided his property between them. I think this is worth noticing. I've never noticed this. I've always read this as the youngest son comes to the father and says, give me my inheritance. And he gives him his inheritance. But the language says he divides it between them. Both brothers get their inheritance, which means that the father surrenders his property to his sons. Now, there's a lot of debate as how it actually broke down. Did the older brother get the real estate, and because he's supposed to get 2/3 of the inheritance, did the younger brother just get the more movable financial side? I don't know. But it's so when the we'll see this later, that when the older brother complains, you never let me do X, Y, or Z. We've been told he owns X, Y, and Z now. Now, his father is still the patriarch of the family, so he has final say in that, true. But in terms of possession, both the older and the younger brother now own everything that the father has. One is prodigal with it, he wastes it. The other despises it and will not use it for anything. So I think this is just an interesting little note there. Then to go down to verse 13. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and took a journey to a far country. There he squandered his property with reckless living. So squandered, that's an interesting word there. It's a fairly rare word in the New Testament, used only 9 times total. But what is interesting, though it's a rare word, it shows up almost immediately. Actually, we could say immediately. So right here, you have a story about a younger son who squanders. He's a prodigal. And then look at chapter 16, verse 1. So the prodigal son parable ends at the end of chapter 15. Next verse. He also said to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering, wasting. He was a prodigal. Now, you think that's an accident? I don't think so. You can see why Peter Winn's approach is rather helpful. It's because we isolate these stories, and Peter is showing that actually Jesus is making an argument, and he keeps coming back to this parable. He's developing his argument. So he tells a story about how the younger son squanders his possessions, and that this would have been shameful for him to do that. Because self-righteous people are careful with everything they have. It's part of their self-righteousness. And so what you'll get then is the thought that, of course this younger brother went and did that. That's what sinners do. They are fools. So we're not only righteous, we are wise. And so Jesus tells this parable about a boy that squanders, he wastes what he is given. But then he tells another parable in the next chapter. It's all about wastefulness. In fact, go down to chapter 16, verse 14. Or I think I have it up here, but you can look at it. The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things, and they ridiculed him. And so Jesus is messing with them. He's building this argument where he is condemning them. So those who squander wealth are often viewed as lazy and foolish, whereas those who, like the Pharisees, are very careful and they calculate everything, so it adds to their self-righteousness. Again, all of this is about self-righteousness. In fact, if you go to the prodigal son narrative, notice the accusation he makes against his brother, chapter 15, verse 30. But when this son of yours came, we talked about that phrase, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you kill the fatted calf for him. Now, there is no way he knows that. Where did that information about prostitutes come from? What's likely here is he is making an assumption based off of his behavior. Well, that's what sinners do. They squander their money on things like prostitutes. They are fools who waste what money they are given, or are so wicked and lazy they can never find financial security. And that's a temptation we still have today, you know. But again, through this language, Jesus has heightened the self-righteousness. So as Jesus tells the story, the Pharisees are over here on the outside saying, yep, that's what happens with sinners like that. These tax collectors, they are robbing the Jews, and they're just wasting their money. You can't trust them with money, because you can't trust them with anything, because they're fools and they're unrighteous. You can trust me with it. You know? Or look at the phrase severe famine. This is... I thought I put it up there. Yeah, there it is, which means other things are probably out of order. Severe famine, verse 14, chapter 15, verse 14. So he goes, when he had spent everything, severe famine arose in that country. He began to be in need. Now, we readers skip this because we've never experienced famine. We've talked about this. And I noticed that the phrase is severe famine, not famine. And so I did a bit of a word study, and Williams was helpful in this regard. When you see the phrase severe famine, the difference between famine and severe famine is the length of time. Famine could be a season, it could be a brief time, a drought, something like that. Severe famines happen for years. They just don't end, it seems like it. And so we get several of these referenced in the Bible. For example, Genesis 12, this is right after the covenant with Abraham. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abraham went down to Egypt to sojourn, for the famine was severe. Notice, you got famine here, you got famine there, with the adjective severe. So what's the point? It was a severe famine, right? In Hebrew, repetition is emphasis. And so it's not just a famine, it's a severe famine. So what does Abraham have to do? He can't stay in Canaan. He has to sojourn to Egypt. Well, what happens later on in the story of Jacob's sons? Well, when the famine had spread over all the land, remember Joseph is second in command here. Joseph opened all the storehouses he'd been building up for 7 years, and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land. So what ends up happening is that the grandsons of Abraham sojourn to Egypt where there is food. It's a severe famine, this one lasting 7 years. Or consider the story of Elijah. See the same language. So Elijah went to show himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria. And we know this last, remember the drought was 3.5 years. If you have a drought, you have famine. You got to have water for plants. So in the story, the reason this matters is we do this, and actually that means we're falling into the trap Jesus is setting for the Pharisees. We say, well, the kid's a scoundrel. I mean, he just went off, spent all his money. He got what he deserved, feeding pigs. Yeah, he deserved it. And teach him a lesson. But what does Jesus do? He says, actually, though true, there were circumstances outside of his control leading to his demise. It's an interesting little point. You hear the self-righteousness? That's what I love about it. Now, yes, he should have been wiser with his resources so that when famine came, he could better navigate and persevere through it. Absolutely, you should do that. At the same time, there ain't much you can do about a severe famine in an agricultural world. There was a lot of farmers at the church I pastored before, and one of them would say, you never make up a bad year in farming. And I think there's truth to that. And so when you go years without regular access to food, that's food. Yeah, Don. Never recover from a strike. Yeah, similar. Yeah, ask Hollywood right now. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So again, he is rebuking them for saying that what's wrong with this man is only tied to his choices. That's a significant explanation for hitting rock bottom. It's not the only explanation. Sometimes the wicked suffer for things outside of their control. Sometimes the righteous suffer for things outside of their control. But again, we're guilty of this. We read the story and we're like, yeah, he got what he deserved. When in reality, of all the places he could have ran off to, he happened to go to the place that had a famine. It apparently did infect where his father was living. But he goes on the far country, and that's the place. That's rotten luck. He's still a fool. He's still a sinner. But he's also a bit unlucky. Or consider verse 15 to 16, the word citizen. Remember, he attaches himself to one of the citizens of that country. Now, again, that's a word we look over. What is a citizen to us? A citizen is anyone born in these United States or has been made a citizen by the United States. That's a process. So you meet natural-born citizens, and then you meet those who immigrated and became citizens. But the far majority of people in these United States, in these borders, are citizens of the United States. We don't think about the privileges of citizenship. In the Roman world, you did. Paul was a citizen. So whenever he was wrongly abused by the system, he could claim, I'm a citizen, I have rights. I'm going to go talk to Caesar myself. Now, we're citizens. I mean, the current president, or whoever he or she may be, it's too busy for you and me. Let's be honest, Good, bad, or ugly, too busy for you and me. But that was a right and privilege that Roman citizens had. But what it also does is it heightens the distinction between this kid that once was rich, but now he's at rock bottom. So he's down here with the pigs against a citizen. He is someone with position, with influence, with privileges. So much so that when this poor kid attached himself to him, he could just say, "Go feed the pigs, you peon." Right? So it heightens that distinction. One more in Act 1 rather, and that is verse 22. So the brother has come back, or the son has come back, verse 22. The father said to his servant, "Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet." I love this point that for the father, this has felt like eternity, and now that his son has returned, it is as if he has no time left. He's in a hurry for the first time. This is Lord of the Rings reference, so I got to put $1 in the cup. Gandalf makes this point. He says something like, 600 years I've been on the earth with men, and now I feel like I have no time. That's the father here. So he's been agonizing the distance of his son, that he's lost his son. But now that he's arrived, he's in a hurry. Quick, grab it, and grab the ring and the robe and all of that. Also notice that the father never addresses the younger son, never actually says anything to him. Now, it's implied by action. He addresses the older son, but his actions, particularly in setting up a feast and celebrating, communicate that he's been received into sonship. But he never actually addresses the son. But he has to plead with the older brother. That's significant because that's what Jesus is doing in the parable. He's pleading with the Pharisees. Come in, celebrate with us. But what about Act 2? So here with the older brother. Notice verse 25. Now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. Now, attentive readers and listeners to the story, you've come across the phrase, drew near. Now, I say that, I never noticed this. Never once noticed this. Go back to chapter 15, verse 1. Now the tax collectors and the sinners were all drawing near, and they were hearing what Jesus had to say. And we don't see this phrase again, I don't believe, until we read, not of the younger son who draws near, but of the older son. But pay attention to what Jesus is doing. By saying that the older brother has to draw near, it implies the older brother is far off. So the question then is, will the older brother, thus the Pharisees, in drawing near, will he listen? Because the first people we met who drew near, they listened to the Father. Will these guys do it? Of course, we know the answer to that, don't we? And so Jesus is drawing contrast between far and near. So the brother that was the farthest away is now the nearest. The one that was the nearest is now the farthest away. That's good writing, isn't it? It's good storytelling. So the point is, there is not always a correlation between proximity to God and intimacy with Him. In fact, in 3 chapters later, Jesus makes that point. In Luke chapter 18 is this fun little parable. And here's the main meat I want us to see. It's the tax collector and the Pharisee. So the tax collector is like on the outside of the temple. He looks down and he beats his breast. He won't look up. The Pharisee wants to be right in the middle of the action. He wants everyone to hear his prayers. And it says, but the tax collector, standing far off. You see the connection. He's far away from the heart of the temple. Wouldn't even lift up his eyes to heaven, beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified. So he's far off, but he drew near. The Pharisee drew near, but was far off. Isn't that brilliant? I would never, I've read this 1,000 times the last few weeks, and I never noticed the connection between verse 1 and verse 25. But then how he keeps returning back to this theme to the Pharisees. Your problem is you think you're near, but you're far. If you're going to draw near, you need to listen to me. Or consider the word served in, I didn't even read the rest of it. Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled. The one who humbles himself will be exalted. That's the story of the prodigal son, isn't it? He finally has to humble himself, and he's exalted as into sonship. The one who exalts himself, I do everything right, and you did nothing for me. He's the one humble. He stays on the outside. Yeah, yeah. But salvation is essentially us confessing that we need salvation.
Think about the tornado stuff like this, the people that recovered and us, you appear to have lost everything, a few years later, you lost nothing.
Yeah.
Your family maybe, or that, you might have lost loved ones or those things, but as an individual, you didn't have it anyway.
Yeah.
It wasn't yours.
Right.
And it's weird.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Yeah. 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 Well, let's look at the word served. This is verse 28. But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him. But he answered, verse 29, "Look, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command." Now, my ESV says served. The Greek word is doulos. It means slave. And it's used all over the place in the New Testament, so I don't want to chase that rabbit. So that's why you will find a few translations that bring this out. So the not inspired version is one of those, NIV, that's a joke. You'll notice the NIV says, "I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders." I think that's a really good translation, especially when you call it orders. You know, the New Living Translation, first time I ever read through the Bible was the New Living Translation. All these years I've slaved for you. The Net Bible is my favorite translation. No one uses it or reads it. I don't even have a printed version of it yet. Look, there are these many years I have worked like a slave for you. Now you need to note why this is significant. What is it he is saying? The irony of the story is that he's not a slave. He's a son. In fact, he's more than a son. He's the property owner. Remember that the father divided the inheritance between them. Not just the younger brother, but them. So he is the property owner. The success of the farm and everything else benefits him first and foremost. He's the guy in charge now. Now, again, it's a patriarchal system, all that, yes. But he is the property owner. And yet, he comes to his father not as a son, but as a slave. So notice this, that he feels like a son, a slave, despite being a son. Now, we humans are weird, but that is one of the biggest challenges for a lot of people, is we have convinced ourselves of things that simply aren't true. We are sons and daughters of God. And yet, when we approach him, we often approach him as if we are his slaves. Now, theologically, that language of slavery, we can look at it another time. That does apply to us. But here, he simply feels a certain way, therefore it must be true. What the younger son learned is he feels he ought to be a slave, but accepts that the father has made him a son. And that's sufficient. This one has always been a son. But he's allowed himself to think he is a slave. And then, I think it's the last one, celebrate, verse 29. These many years I've slaved for you, I've served you, I never disobeyed your command. You never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. Now, celebration, of course, is a major theme in chapter 15, right? It opens up in verse 1. Jesus is feasting with tax collectors and sinners. That's a form of celebration. You know? Verse 6, when the shepherd comes home, he calls together his friends and his neighbors and saying to them, "Rejoice for me, I found my sheep." Okay? Verse 9, when the woman found her coin, she called together her gal pals. Right? It's in the feminine. She called all of her girlfriends, and they say, "Rejoice for me, for I found the coin that I lost." What do we read in chapter 15, verse 23? "Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let us eat and celebrate." You remember that we argue that the main point of chapter 15, at least according to John MacArthur, I think he's right, is the joy of God. And so it's not surprising then we see this chapter all about celebration and feasting and whatnot. And so here comes the older brother, and what does he want? He wants to celebrate. This is all he's ever wanted. He's mad because he never got to celebrate. Now, there's some real irony here, of course. He wants to celebrate and feast, but he refuses to join his brother and father in celebrating and feasting. That's the irony of it. The dad is like, "But that's why I came to get you." Didn't you get the invitation? It says, celebrate. Right there. It says, celebrate good times, come on. And I don't understand, what am I missing here? You want to celebrate? Let's celebrate. Right? So you can see just at the distance that this brother is at. And so there's more to it here, and that is that he prefers 2 young goats over the fattened calf. Now notice, what he wants is a lesser celebration. So the father has offered him the feast of a lifetime, the sort of thing you would get at a wedding where it would last for a week. Whew, I'm glad it's not like that anymore. I'll tell you, an hour or 2 was enough. I mean, receptions, I'd like for us to cancel those things. Anyways, so you get like a 7-day feast. Yeah, Dawn?
That verse up there where it says, I've never disobeyed your orders. I know he's lying right there. That's the first of all.
Of course, yeah.
And other exaggerations he's making. And plus at the same thing you see in the scribes and Pharisees blowing things out of proportion
Yeah,
and lying.
right. Yeah. Yeah. So this is where Keller comes in, and this is the prodigal God part of it, and that the Father is prodigal with His grace and love, and yet, so His wealth is squandered, prodigaled by the younger son. His grace is squandered by the older son. So it's prodigal God. I still don't like the title, but I think it is somewhat witty. So you'll notice here that what he wants is a lesser celebration. What he wants is also an exclusive celebration. So you'll notice in this whole chapter, the shepherd invites all of his friends. The woman invites all of her friends. The father invites everybody to this feast. It is inclusive. It is open-ended. Come and feast with me. And if you read the other parables of Jesus, particularly Matthew's gospel, this is the common one. Hey, I invited all these people. They didn't come. Go out into the streets, invite everyone to come in. This is a common theme. He's inviting. Everyone just come in and dine with me, feast with me. Let's celebrate these good things. And so notice he wants a small, lesser party with his choice of friends. And the 2 people he does not want present there are his father and his brother. So what is Jesus saying about the Pharisees and religion in particular? He is saying that what you want is a lesser gospel. And it is always exclusive at the cost of everyone else. The best you get is a little goat or 2. I've offered you a feast that will cover the nations. Don't you want to be part of that? Again, that in the parables, he says that when one sinner repents, the heavens start to sing. Don't you want to be part of that party? What you have is this little exclusive group where you pat each other on the back and you compare who's more righteous than the other. That's not a very fun party at all. It's interesting, isn't it? Jesus is inviting us to celebrate, to party. And so we get, it looks like you will get out early. You're welcome. We come to the ending. What do we do with this? It is not an ending. It's fitting to celebrate and be glad, he says. Your brother was dead and now alive. They probably would have held a funeral for him. He was lost and found. So he's like those other parables. You remember that John MacArthur, because there's not an ending, he interprets it as a warning. That we know how the story ends, that Christ is crucified. So he concludes the story. He writes his own conclusion that the brother picks up a block of wood and beats the father over the head with it. And that's the picture of the cross. Keller leaves it as an invitation. And that he leaves it to the Pharisees listening and saying, will you too hear instead of grumble? And will you come in? You're drawing near, but will you listen? It's an invitation for Keller. For Peter Williams, it's a false lead. I think this, again, I think is brilliant. So we've already shown that the first parable parallels the lost son. So the sheep goes away from home and returns. The second parable parallels the older son, that what is lost is actually at home, but has to be pursued. And so it's far away in the sense that it can't be found, but it's right there. And so we, the reader, we think, well, I know how the story ends. The Pharisees come in, they're found. And it's a misdirection. It's a really creative writing trick. Now, it's ruined because we know how the story ends. But imagine if you're reading this for the first time and you're picking up on these little nuances. And you're not going to the first time, of course. You think, oh, there's not an ending because I already know how it ends. The Pharisees come in, and Jesus has united the righteous and the unrighteous, the pious and the impious. Isn't that incredible? Isn't Jesus awesome? But what do we find? This time, the coin wasn't found. Not because it wasn't searched for, but because the Son didn't want to be found. He wanted to stay in the far country, if you will, out in the field, away from the Father. And when the Father comes out to entreat of him, he will crucify him. It's so subtle, but it's right there. It's so well written. So whenever we read the first two parables, we often think, they're not necessary. Actually, in terms of storytelling, they're critical to the power of the narrative itself. So what we want to do next week is the real meat and potatoes. Right? This is the salad. All right, so you get kind of his approach. What we want to do is actually go back over the parable again. You're going to be sick of the story. And Jesus actually, you see it up close, and he's going to broaden out. And what he does to the Pharisees is pretty impressive. But you have to get your tickets and come back next week. Okay? All right. So normally I'd ask Danny if we missed anything, but Danny wouldn't even be here. So Don, did we miss anything?
No, I was just thinking about it, some experiences that they had. But, Peter kept talking about long suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Father, but Peter says that long suffering brings repentance, which it did in this case.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the prodigal that came back is very much like us. But we
Yeah.
got all kinds of promise that were, some of us kept it, and some of us messed it up.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that's the beauty of the gospel is Jesus still pursues prodigals and the righteous, which would take us back to Tim Keller's reading, that you have the legalists, those who are legalistic and those who are antinomian, that grace is sufficient for both.
Did that kid have anything to do with the Pharisees' sacrificial system? Whatever, system?
Kid.
Whatever that word is.
Oh, you're talking about the goats?
Yeah.
That's an interesting thought. I hadn't considered that. Maybe that's why he references the goats. Yeah, I know. I sometimes I would like to just half a minute in your brain, but most of the time I'm like, no.
There's not even room in there for me.
No, I don't think I want that.
But I was just curious about it.
Yeah, so 2 goats. Yeah, why pick 2 goats, one for sacrifice and one to devour? I don't. That's. Oh yeah. That's yeah.
It's ritual, but ritual wasn't the whole point of salvation anyway.
That's interesting. So what he's saying is the 2 goats, right? The older brother wants 2 goats. Where in the Bible? Now this is you're getting close to where we're going to go next week. We're going to go all the way to the Old Testament, but I don't think he brings up the goats, and I'll go over it again this week. Be like the 3rd time through his book. There's 2 goats of the Day of Atonement. So there's the propitiatory goat that is sacrificed. There's the expiatory goat that the bloody hands of the priest is laid on the scapegoat and is sent out into the wilderness. So you have 2 goats. That is an interesting thought worth contemplating. If that is the case, the brothers' idea of celebrating is religious services, traditions. It's not actually feasting and laughing. Yeah.
Perfect son.
That's an interesting thought, and I'd hate to give you credit for it. Yeah. But whether or not that's the intention, I think it's consistent with what you get with legalists. Their idea of celebration is pretty boring. Yeah. So if we bring it home, like we believe in worship service. I mean, we're at a Bible study now. This is good. This is what we're supposed to do. But we understand that's not sufficient for the health of a church, right? That we got to be able to laugh together. We got to be feast together. We got to celebrate together. We got to rejoice together. That is an essential part of the Christian journey is the ability to celebrate, no matter our circumstances. That's critical to the gospel and living out the gospel. So you may be onto something. That's worth chewing on.
Well, I got another thing for you to chew on.
Okay. So remember, you're getting out late. It's not my fault.
In the days of Noah, there will be eating and drinking and giving in marriage. And I got to wonder, it's nothing wrong with giving in marriage, but maybe it's to the same person 2 or 3 times.
You'd have to draw it out in the text.
Do what?
You'd have to draw that out in the text. It doesn't say that in
I
particular.
know it doesn't say that, but there's what you call the feminine verse and the male verse and this other kind of stuff that you interpret.
Oh, the sons of God and the daughters of men.
No.
No.
Back at Noah said it'll be the same, or Christ said it'll be the same as in the days of Noah,
Mhm.
for eating and drinking and giving in marriage.
Yeah, the sons of God and daughters of men were coming together.
Yeah, but what I'm talking about, if it's sons of God and daughters of men are going to come together when he comes back, it's going to be like that.
Mm-hmm.
But my question was, there's nothing wrong with 2 people being married,
Mm-hmm.
but it gets to be an issue when they start trading off and remarrying and divorcing and all that stuff.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And I just wonder if that's implied because the act of marriage is commanded.
Yeah. Maybe, yeah. It may be implied. I don't know.
It's total indifference towards God is the other meaning of it, the one that's most accepted.
Yeah, yeah. So what were they doing in the days of Noah? If you want to call it marriage, it was illicit marriages. Depending on your interpretation of the sons of God, daughters of men. Yeah, yeah.
Now we're at the highest point in America probably of living together without marriage, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and those who cohabitate before marriage, they increase their chances of divorce like tenfold. It's pretty crazy. Okay, anything else in addition to Don?
I'm going home.
You didn't bring your motorcycle, did you?
No,
Okay.
still a little cool for me.
Yeah, I get that.
More into the 72 degrees.
Yeah.
There's a motorcyclist that comes by our house every day. Is that him?
Yeah, it might be. Knowing him.
That's
That's,
guy comes by my house out
it-
there on a motorcycle even when it's snowing.
And
Yeah.
it's real loud and guns sitting there and, oh gosh,
it's probably where Don really gets his best thoughts.
It's really quiet enough, but it's a Honda. It's really quiet.
okay, so you're not
Yeah.
one then.
Yeah, no, it's not him. I like to tease him, but I know it's not him. All right, if nothing else, how about we close out in prayer? Chris, who's filling in for Don, Don's a little bit on the weather today, so I appreciate Chris and all that he does for us in general. Will you close us in prayer?